Well, hello, dear listener. I'm so glad you've decided to join me out here tonight by the fire for the return of the Campfire Sessions here on Tapes of Trepidation. For those who are joining us for the first time for the sessions, we do things a little differently than we normally do here on the podcast. Over the next 2 months, we'll be taking a break from the hustle and bustle of life and spend the night out here sharing creepy tales that are best told around a campfire. Every week, we'll present 3 stories that will have a general theme, which I will share with you. Aside from myself sharing these stories, you can expect to hear from a few familiar friends along the way, including 2 new friends who are joining us for the very first time on Tapes of Trepidation. I cannot wait for that. We've got a wonderful mix of original stories, creepypastas, and some stories based on urban legends. So, without further ado, let's begin this year's Campfire Sessions. Tonight, we're starting off with 3 stories about a topic near and dear to my heart, and that's camping. I think most of us can relate to stories about camping. And we may have even heard our first spooky story around the campfire during that camping session. I know myself, I definitely experienced that when I was a kid. These 3 stories are specifically about camping trips that ended in not so great circumstances, which may leave you thinking about them the next time you're in a tent in the woods at night and you find yourself scared in a sleeping bag. Our first story this evening is written and narrated by me, TJ Hodder. A young man becomes obsessed with a fort he's built in the woods, spending the night camping out in it against his parents' wishes. That is until he has a terrifying encounter with the thing with flashlight eyes. When I was around 10 years old, I became obsessed with building a fort in the woods behind my childhood home. After watching a survival show with my dad, I decided to build my own shelter. Over the next few weeks, I hauled branches into the forest and pieced together a crude fort using some of my dad's tools and more duct tape than I care to admit. My mom gave me an old blanket to use as a door, and before long it became my favorite place to spend time. I swept and cleaned the area that would be my floor, brought in a blanket and an old beanbag chair, and spent nearly every free moment out there. I'd read comics, play my Game Boy, or simply sit and listen to the sounds of the forest. Eventually, I begged my parents to let me sleep in the fort. They refused, worried about bugs, rain, and the cold. But I started sneaking out there after they went to bed. I'd take my sleeping bag, a flashlight, a battery-powered clock radio, and a few snacks. As long as I made it back inside before sunrise, my parents would never know. Hence the clock radio. I did this for several weeks. Most nights were peaceful, though every now and then I'd wake up with the unsettling feeling that something was watching me. I always shook it off, but it was the strangest feeling. Other than that, everything was going great. Until the last night I spent in that fort. It was a cool night when I made my way out into the forest. Settling into my sleeping bag, I started to doze off right away. the sounds of nature lulling me to sleep. Sometime later, I woke to a sound I'd never heard before at night. Footsteps. Not of a rabbit or anything small like that. This was a larger creature of some kind. Pulling out my flashlight, I held it close as the footsteps grew nearer. They were slow, methodical, like whatever was making the noise was trying to be quiet but failing at it. Whatever it was, I could see it moving past my fort through the spaces in the walls, lit up by the moonlight. It was walking like a human, on 2 legs. I thought maybe it was my dad coming to bust me. Then I noticed the breathing. It was heavy and labored, not like how my dad breathed, even if he was out of breath. It slowly made its way to the blanket door of my fort, stopping in front of it for a second before a large, hairy hand reached in and slowly began to pull the blanket away. I panicked, terror fully enveloping me as I pointed my flashlight right at it. As it pulled back the blanket, I turned the flashlight on. Suddenly, the thing bent down and poked its head in. I was met with a horrifyingly pale face, with 2 large, flashlight-like eyes. I froze in horror, the unblinking white glow of its eyes staring a hole through me, blinding me as I looked upon them. I'd never felt fear like I did in that moment. Finally breaking free of my terror, I screamed as loud as I could. I pushed myself into the corner as the thing started trying to grab me and enter my fort. It was too large to fully get in, but it was so close to grabbing me, the flashlight eyes never taking their gaze off me. After struggling and screaming for what felt like forever, I heard my dad in the distance yelling for me as he ran to the fort. The thing with flashlight eyes turned away, then quickly pulled its long, hairy arm back and ran. I fell into a ball and cried. My dad poked his head in, yelling for me and asking what happened. I couldn't even speak. He coaxed me out and carried me inside. After waking my mom up, getting me changed and sitting with me for a couple of hours, I finally told them what happened. They looked at each other as if they thought it had been a nightmare, but they assured me I was safe. A few days later, they asked me again about that night. My story never changed. I ended up grounded, but they never had to worry about me sneaking out again. I never went back to the fort. My dad later dismantled it. We rarely spoke about what happened. It wasn't until many years later during my final year of high school that I thought about that night again. My parents and I were having breakfast when my mom gasped while she was reading the paper. She said that police had arrested a man who lived only a few blocks away. He was facing charges involving kidnapping, assaults, and multiple murders of minors dating back decades. According to the article, the man moved from town to town, targeting children before disappearing under a new name. Apparently, he had settled in our neighborhood years earlier. Advances in DNA analysis tying him to his heinous crimes. Turning the paper around for my dad and I to read, I froze, my heart starting to beat as if it was about to leap out of my throat, and a shiver went down my spine. The headline and details of the article, as disturbing as they were, wasn't what caused my heart to beat faster and the hair to raise on the back of my neck. The man in the picture was a large, hairy man and was staring right at the camera with a sharp look of malice in his eyes. eyes that were behind a pair of thick, circular rimmed bifocal glasses that looked an awful lot like the front of a flashlight. Our next story, written by Daniel Barton and narrated by friend of the show Kai Fayden. A group of friends have a strange and terrifying encounter with a bizarre being on the best camping trip ever.
The kids sat around the campfire, laughing and joking, their voices overpowering the crackle of flames and the pop of wood. The darkness was held at bay by the light, and so the children felt safe, secure, and certain that all the scary things that had lurked in the darkness couldn't get any closer. The moon peeked out from behind the clouds, filling the clearing with a gentle glow, making the night seem a little more magical. And the kids all looked up, basking for a moment in the beauty of the night sky. That's when it happened. A small sound, a pitter-patter of footsteps, now audible in the relative silence, came from behind one of the boys, causing the child to turn and look around in surprise, one of his hands clutching his friend instinctively. The friend pulled away, mocking the panicked boy, who insisted he had heard footsteps. The moment gone, the rest of the boys joined in teasing the startled boy, until one of the group pointed and asked what that was. As one, the group all turned to see where the finger pointed, and the laughter died down. There, on the steps of one of the cabins, stood a small doll. It was clothed in a simple summer dress, though the dress itself was at least a century out of date. Suddenly, there was the sound of laughter from the opposite direction, followed by more footsteps. The sound caused several of the boys to cry out as they all turned to peer into the darkness to see what was out there. One of the boys called out, demanding to know who was messing around. But there was no answer. Only silence. Then, the boy who had spotted the doll drew their attention back to the step. The doll had disappeared. A shriek suddenly tore from the throat of one of the boys. The others looked to see what he was screaming at and found themselves joining in a chorus of terror. There, from behind a glass window, a face peered at them from within one of the cabins, its twisted features too large and misshapen to be anything human. Its smile widened when it saw it had their attention, revealing too many rows of tiny, razor-sharp teeth. The boys all screamed and scrambled away, running from the fire into the darkness, back toward town, the lights, and the promised safety of civilization. From within the abandoned camp came a joyful peal of laughter, and a small figure playfully jumped out of the shadows, wearing a dress almost a century out of date. It looked up at the cabin where the inhumane face now regarded the smaller figure, and nodded approvingly, causing the tiny doll-like creature to jump for joy. This was turning out to be the best camping trip ever.
In our final story this evening, written and narrated by me, TJ Hodder, a man has a downright horrifying encounter in a campsite's washroom, proving that even inside walls and with lights on, terror can find you. Leaving him scarred, he's unsure he'll ever forget his experience in the campsite washroom. I've never really enjoyed camping. When I was younger, my father used to make us go several times a year. Sure, there were parts of it that were fun, but overall it wasn't an enjoyable experience. mainly due to the type of camping he wanted us to do. It was the let's walk into the forest with no supplies, set up a tent, and hope we catch our dinner type of camping. Roughing it to the max, I guess you could say. Don't even get me started on the bathroom situation. He'd just look at me and say, "You know what they say about bears, bud." So I'm sure I have those childhood experiences to thank for my mild hatred of camping as an adult. That all being said, my friends convinced me to go camping last weekend after a few weeks of pestering. Don't worry, this is a legit campground. It even has a bathroom and everything. No need to shit in the woods and wipe with a leaf. So I caved and decided to go. After the experience I had, though, I don't think I'm ever going camping again. We had a fairly uneventful first night. The accommodations were pretty nice, actually. The campsite was well kept, had a built-in fire pit and grill, and there was even an outlet, believe it or not. But the creme de la creme of this site? The fully functioning washrooms that were only about a minute walk away from our tents. I was very happy about that one. Once we settled in, we shared a few beers, fired up the grill, and when night came, we made a fire and roasted marshmallows. Pretty standard stuff. The following day was a blast. We went down to the lake and spent most of the day hanging out on the beach or in the water. Absolutely my kind of day. By the time we got back to the site, we were all pretty tired, so we just grilled a few hot dogs and called it a night. I woke up a few hours later when the call of nature struck me. The kind that I promised myself I'd never do in the woods again. So I grabbed my flashlight and made my way over to the campsite washroom. It was eerie walking there alone in the dark. Although it was only a short walk through some trees, I felt like a million eyes were on me as twigs snapped with each step, seemingly amplified by the deadening silence around me. After what felt like a little too long of a walk, the light from the building that housed the washrooms lit up the ground in front of me, and I scurried in. Sitting down, I took a breath and let myself relax, feeling much safer surrounded by concrete walls and a stall. As I finished my business, I sat a little longer than I meant to scroll on my phone, when I heard a strange sound coming from outside of the washroom. It sounded like someone walking, but in a very staggered manner. Almost like one foot was dragging behind the other one. I didn't think much of it until I heard those same staggering footsteps on the concrete floor of the washroom. The footsteps were slow, methodical, with the sound of that one foot dragging ever so slowly behind the other. Whoever this was continued their staggered, dragging walk right up to the stall I was in and stood in front of it. I could see through the small gap in the door that someone was clearly standing there. I sat in silence, praying they would go away without the need for me to say a word. But they didn't. I sat for a couple of minutes before finally saying, "Hey bud, this stall's occupied. Sorry, I'll just be a second." Doing my best to sound stern but polite. There was silence on the other side of the stall door. Then suddenly, the whole stall started shaking, as if this person was trying to rip the door off. I screamed for them to stop, and with shaking hands tried to call one of my friends to come help me when the shaking stopped. I took several deep breaths as I looked up from my phone. There, through the gap in the stall, I saw a pure white eye staring back at me, along with a toothless grin filled with the darkest of intentions. Then, without warning, they began to try and jam their hand through the gap in the stall. I screamed as blood began to ooze through the opening, the sound of skin tearing, muscles squishing, and bones breaking as this thing shoved its hand through. One of my friends finally answered their phone half asleep, only to be met with my screaming for help that I was being attacked in the campsite washroom. My eyes closed, not wanting to see this grotesque sight of the hand pushing through the gap any longer. Just wishing it was all a terrible nightmare. A second later, I heard running feet and my friend yelling for me. I opened my eyes when the stall door busted open. The sight of my friends greeting me instead of some horrid monster. There I was, tears in my eyes, absolutely panicked, all with my pants still down around my ankles. My friends comforted me, helped me up, and asked me what happened. After I talked it through with them, they were convinced I had fallen asleep on the toilet. Since they didn't see anyone or anything inside when they ran up, we had a laugh about it. As I convinced myself they were right. It really must have just been a vivid nightmare. As we walked out of the washroom, I realized I had dropped my phone in the commotion. Going back to retrieve it, the stall door gently swung shut with the breeze of me walking into it to grab my phone. As I turned to leave, I froze. I knew at that moment it was not a nightmare. As on the back of the stall door, I saw a large patch of dark, fresh blood. This has been Campfire Sessions 1. Scared in a Sleeping Bag by the Tapes of Trepidation Horror Narration Podcast. The first story this evening, The Thing with Flashlight Eyes, and the third story, My Experience in the Campsite Washroom, were both written and narrated by me, TJ Hodder. The second story, The Best Camping Trip Ever, was written by Daniel Barton, who you're going to hear a lot from this year, and was narrated by friend of the show, Kai Fayden. Check out Kai's fantastic horror narrations on his YouTube channel, Poltergeist, as well as his VTuber channel and streaming. You can find a link to Kai in the show notes. The Tapes of Trepidation theme, including the acoustic version you're currently hearing, was written and performed by JM Scherf. The Tapes of Trepidation logo, including the Campfire Sessions overlay and any other graphic design work, was created by Jason Rees from Jaybird Digital Arts. If you enjoyed what you heard tonight, be sure to stay tuned for more and check out the rest of what Tapes of Trepidation has to offer. Normally we do things a little differently, with unique music and sound design for most of our stories. If you enjoyed this, I'm certain you'll love what else we have to offer. Support the show by subscribing and leaving a rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, your favorite podcatcher, or like and subscribe on YouTube. And be sure to tell your friends. Word of mouth is extremely helpful to a small indie horror podcast like this one. And check us out on social media through the link tree in the show notes. We have Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Discord. And if you'd like to support the show a little more, consider joining the Tapes of Trepidation Patreon. With as little as $5 a month, you can gain access to monthly bonus short story / Michael Pasta narrations, the weekly behind-the-scenes podcast within the archive, and more. So come, join us, and become trapped within the archive. Just like my current patrons, Doozer Pindan, Ronan Gamori, Patrick Stewart, Madam Strangeways, Tori, Kai Fayden, JT Johnson, and Darrell Rivas. Thank you all so much for the support. And big shoutouts again to Doozer Pindan, who is also known as Daniel Barton, the author of one of the stories in this episode, and also to Kai Fayden, the guest narrator for this episode. Thank you all so much for the support. I seriously couldn't do this without my patrons. All content used on Tapes of Trepidation is either original, used with permission, or is available on your Creative Commons share-alike license. All rights reserved, unless otherwise stated. Licensing information can be found in the show notes. This podcast and its content may not be redistributed or rebroadcast without the express written consent of Tapes of Trepidation and the story's author. Thank you all so much for listening. And we'll see you next time as we venture back out next Friday evening to the campsite and continue the Campfire Sessions. Be safe heading back now, because you never know what might be lurking in the dark.